I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, I'm chatting with Sara Brunsvold. Sara creates stories that speak hope, truth, and life. Influenced by humble women of God who find his fingerprints in the everyday, she does the same in her life and her storytelling. Sara is the author of The Extraordinary Deaths of Mrs. Kipp and her upcoming novel, The Divine Proverb of Streusel. Sara's recognitions include the 2020 ACFW Genesis Award for Contemporary Fiction and the 2023 winner of the Christy Award for her first novel. She lives with her family in Kansas City, where she can often be spotted writing at a park or a library. Welcome to the show, Sara.
Thank you so much, Kara. Thanks for having me today.
I am so excited to talk to you. The Extraordinary Deaths of Mrs. Kipp was one of my favorite books that I've read all year this year. So I just knew I had to ask if you would come talk to me on the show.
Oh, that is so wonderful. Thank you for that compliment. And it is a delight to talk to you today.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many friends I've then gone on and recommended the book of you have to read this. And I don't even know how to categorize it sometimes because there's so much depth to the story. So it's very beautiful.
Oh, praise God. Oh, thank you for that.
You're very welcome. Well, I feel like you're so much more than this bio. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so as a writer, and as a reader to a certain extent, I love writing stories that are set in my native Midwest. So if you love Midwestern stories set in the Midwest that deal with intergenerational relationships and dynamics, I think we could be friends because that's who I am as a writer. And I tend to gravitate to stories like that as a reader as well. I grew up in a multi-generational farm community where it was actually, so the community I grew up in is kind of the genesis for the setting and the community that we see in the Divine Proverb of Streusel. Okay. So it's a German Lutheran immigrant hamlet that was founded by my ancestors. My ancestors helped found this little hamlet in Northeast Missouri. And so the church that they helped found was the church that I grew up in. And multiple generations of my family were in that church. I grew up with both sets of grandparents and all of my aunts and uncles, and I have a lot of them. And my mom is from a very large family. And grew up on the same farm that my brother and I were the third generation on that farm. And so, I think the love for intergenerational dynamics and relationships started very early on in life. And I don't think I really appreciated how special that was until I kind of got out on my own in the world and moved to the city, far away from where I grew up and realized that not everybody else had that, growing up, didn't really have that same level of understanding or sensitivity to other generations. And so, I love that. And I love hearing other people's stories and, especially stories that speak life and truth and hope. I love stories from people who have lived through some really difficult circumstances and have come out the stronger for it or the wiser for it. I just get a real kick out of stories like that. So that's kind of that's who I am. And as a reader, as a writer, and as a human being, I love connecting with people and hearing their stories.
That's beautiful. I was going to ask if you still lived out in this little hamlet, but it sounds like no, you've moved to the city now.
I have, I moved to the city, job opportunities, much like people before me, moving off the farm and trying to find their way in other circumstances. But my heart is still on that little plot of land in Northeast Missouri. It's still everybody has a mental happy place that they go to. Sure. And so for me, it's on our farm there, it sounds fancy, but it's really not. We call them the river bottoms, but there's a hill that overlooks the river bottoms. And there's this one little spot on top of the hill that looks out over the valley. And that's my mental happy place. So when I
Yes.
am just feeling a little overwhelmed or just need to find some peace, that's where I mentally place myself is right there on that hill.
Yeah, I love that. Is the farm still in existence in your family?
Well, the technically yes, it's now owned by a distant relative,
Okay.
but yeah, my immediate family no longer owns it. But it's
Okay.
good to know that it's still in good hands.
Yeah. This reminds me, I feel like, of so many small towns of like you can go back, and because your family had such a strong presence in the community, it's everyone knows everyone in these small towns.
Right. Yes. Everyone knows everyone, and everyone knows how the generations connect back.
Yeah.
Like everybody knows who's parent, who's grandparent, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Even with a large family, right? To think about in someone else's mind who's not connected to your family to know those relationships and who goes down what line of the lineage. That
Right.
can be complicated for an
It
outsider.
can. It can be complicated, yes. But also pretty cool, to know. I think that's what not to romanticize small towns too much, but I think there's a lot of just natural bonding that happens in small towns because of that, because there are usually some bloodlines at play or marriage lines at play. And so it's that stereotype of small towns banding together, when times get tough. I mean,
Yeah.
it's true, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in a small town in Illinois as well.
Oh,
And a
nice.
funniest story about my husband, he grew up in the city of Chicago. And so the first time he came out to visit or and meet my family, I guess it was, and my aunt and uncle even live in like an unincorporated, like they're not even in a town. And so he comes out and we're driving out together. And I think it was a holiday or something. We were going for a dinner. And he looks at me and goes, "If I get hurt out here, will I be okay?" And I was like, "We're not uncivilized." Like, and it was
Oh
like
my
so
God.
disconcerting for him who like grew up in the city and, just this bigger city life, like to be out in the middle of nowhere, like really just now I think I've broken him down. Like, I'm like, okay, when you're done with the military, can we go retire to, I want land, I want space. Like, I
Yes.
don't love the city life because it feels too busy and too many people around.
Oh yeah.
Um, and he's now finally, I think we've gotten there, 13 years later.
Oh, good for you. Slow and
So,
steady.
yeah, I don't know that he'll go like super small town, but at least he's open to the idea of like a smaller town. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. I think you will appreciate there is definitely a slower pace
yeah,
to a small town that I miss. There's a lot of benefits to the city. I
true.
agree with him on that. There's a lot of benefits. But yeah, there's just something about that slower pace, and I don't know, it's just a different mentality in smaller towns. So I do miss that.
We lived in Sicily was one of our duty stations, and it definitely has that
Oh.
small or that slower pace of life.
Mhm.
And that was one thing as we were getting ready to leave and come back to the States, we're like, that is what we want to hold on to. Like it was
Mhm.
so perfect. We had two of our babies there. So our life was slower anyways. I think just you're
Yeah.
like really immersed in, I mean, it's chaotic in your own family, but you just have to like hunker down and like and be a family unit. But that was one thing, that slow pace of life that we're like, we want
Mm.
to bring that back to the States and not get too chaotic because it is so easy to do to just add all these things on your plate and lose sight of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay. I feel like we've kind of digressed a little bit from from that. So I feel like we're at a really good point. So will we see snippets of this Hamlet in your upcoming novel, The Divine Proverb? Okay.
Yes. Yes. So my mom was sort of a beta reader for this. And she's like, "Oh, I totally recognize."
I
So
love
the
that.
real life setting or the real life town is called West Ely, Missouri,
Okay.
and if anyone is familiar with West Ely, which is going to be a fairly small number of people, but they would easily recognize that as
Okay.
what I'm describing. It goes by the name Edner in the story, but that's what I'm describing. And
Okay.
so yes, it is the setting for the story, and the church that is there in the hamlet is the church of. So there's two point of view characters. There's Uncle Wes, and then Nikki Warner, his niece. And so Uncle Wes is the one who owns the farm and lives on the farm. And
Okay.
so his church, yeah, is and his church community is largely based on this real life hamlet that I knew growing up.
I love that. Well, can you tell us briefly about what the book will be about so we can look
Absolutely.
forward to it?
Yeah, so we have a young woman named Nikki Warner. She's reeling from a family crisis, and she deals with that by cooking her way through her great grandmother's authentic German recipes.
I love that.
And so she's escaping the city life, and she is going to small town, her uncle's farm, and that's where she discovers this handwritten journal among her late grandmother's belongings. No one really knows who wrote it, but it's full of proverbs that have been paired with German recipes. And
Wow.
so she starts cooking her way through it, and the more recipes that she prepares, the more wisdom that she gathers, and the more family history she gathers. And all of that together is helping her figure out the next best thing through this crisis.
Wow. I have the chills as you're talking about finding the handwritten notebook. That would be so amazing to have that.
Oh, yes. And it's actually, as I was researching this book, obviously I dove back into my own family history and
Sure.
legacy, and in that church community that I grew up in. And wouldn't you know it, there were a lot of notebooks and a lot of artifacts within my own family archives that inspired some of the fictional versions that you see in the story. So, for instance, this notebook that she finds, it's inspired by two different things. The first is the idea for that actually came from a book that I read. It was a family memoir that I
Okay.
read. A Kansas City Star reporter wrote about his German immigrant family, and
Interesting.
he
Okay.
mentioned that his grandmother kept what was called, and I guess this was a thing. It's called a common book, and
Okay.
it's just a notebook that you write down bits of wisdom or things that you want to pass on. And she had kept this common book, handwritten, just something that she got at the dime store, nothing fancy, but she was pouring into the pages all this life wisdom that she had gleaned throughout her
Wow.
years, with the intention of giving it to her kids and grandkids. And it just got put away in an attic and forgotten about. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. And then, of course, the other inspiration for it was in my own family artifacts. Of course, I'm finding handwritten German recipes, and
Yes.
I'm finding a little paperback composition notebook where someone has, instead of writing out the wisdom, they found it in what looks like newspapers or magazines, and they have clipped it and then
Oh,
pasted it
cool.
on the pages and some of them were in German, some of them were in English. And, so just those two real life inspirations kind of collided to make this fictional journal where you've got wisdom from the book of Proverbs and from life experience combined with German recipes. And that has been passed down. And um,
I
so
love
yeah, it
that.
was a lot of fun to write. And so you see excerpts from the pages,
Okay,
so
I
the
was gonna
recipes
ask that.
themselves.
Okay.
Yep, yep, yep.
So we could cook
Uh,
alongside the book?
Definitely, yes. So you can cook right alongside Nikki, and so the recipes are included, and the proverbs that go along with them are included. And those were a lot of fun to write and to research because I
Yeah.
had never made a German dish before, even though.
I was gonna ask if this was inspired by your cooking.
Yeah, so even though I grew up with German heritage, we didn't really have a lot of German food growing up.
Okay.
And there are some reasons for that. Things just kind of fall by the wayside
Sure.
over the generations, but I never really prepared any. I didn't even know my grandmother had German recipes, but sure enough, she did. And so that was new for me as well. I had
Yeah.
to cook alongside Nikki, as I was researching the book, and found some new family favorites along the way.
Love it.
And but yeah, it's it was eye-opening for me in a lot of ways. Just I think family stories have a way of illuminating history in
Yeah.
ways that just, straight textbooks don't or can't.
Sure.
And it also helps you understand who you are and where you came from,
Yeah.
by knowing those who in your bloodline before you.
Yeah, I was thinking that as you were saying that is it allows you to immerse yourself in the history of the story too, right? It's
Hmm.
like, okay, this is where I fit in here.
Yeah.
Um, and I love what
Right.
you're saying. I feel like you've probably learned so much about your family, even more than even being raised with them, which is such a unique experience, I feel like, for many Americans. But to also then to learn so much more of them through these books and the recipes that you were cooking. And I imagine there's a connection that comes with that as well.
Yeah, right. So I say that food is often the conduit. Food is such a wonderful representation of someone's culture or
Hmm.
heritage. So to connect through food is like this huge wide open door. It just draws you in, and then I think it just makes you more ripe, shall we say, to receive other things that come with it. So
Yeah.
whether that's learning someone's culture, learning someone's heritage, learning your own heritage, and so and that's definitely true for Nikki in the story as
Yeah.
well. The food is just sort of that open door, but once she's through that door, she begins to understand things in new ways and new and important ways.
Yeah. And it takes you out of, I imagine, right, for Nikki, the character, cooking and focusing on something else that you do have to pay attention to, and you're reading the recipe, right? So there's a certain amount of brain power that has to go into that. And it allows her to come out of the crisis a little bit to start to process, pull like
Right.
almost pull you back down to be able to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's therapeutic in that way,
Yeah.
for sure. And I think that's one of the things that I enjoy about cooking as well. If it's a hard day and cooking, you also have a certain amount of control
Yeah.
over, over how things are coming together, and that's a very therapeutic feeling as well. So yeah,
Yeah.
I like how you phrased that. It does sort of help her come out. Sort of look at things more objectively. She's kind of separating herself from the situation and can see it with new eyes. And
Yeah.
yeah, there's that. I love that about cooking. It is therapeutic.
Yeah, I always joke with my husband that, there's the five love languages they talk about. I'm like, cooking needs to be the sixth because to me, cooking is love. And when I am cooking for my
Hmm.
family, I mean, some days, yes, I'm like slapping stuff together. It's a busy weeknight or something. But to me, when I'm cooking food for my family and then we sit down as a family together, that for me is a form of
Mm,
love, the way I love them.
yeah.
And it just, and I think my family is Italian. So like cooking is very, that is very immersed in your heritage. And so it's just, I knew that from my grandmother. My mom always cooked when I was a kid, and then it's just passed down. And so for me, it's my love language is cooking and giving my
Mm.
family a good meal.
That's beautiful, and it's so true. Yeah, the Italian especially. I mean, there's so much love and emotion that is packed into us, even a simple dish.
Yeah.
Um, and I will say the other thing about cooking too is there's one recipe that kicks off the story, and what I find fascinating is some of these recipes that have been passed down through generations. It's like, how did they know how to do that? How did they know how long to cook something at what temperature? And how did they know that that flavor was going to go with this? And just the resourcefulness and
Yeah.
the amount of intelligence and creativity that goes into preparing a dish, not just for, one meal or one evening, but a dish that sustains generations
Yeah.
of hungry families. I find that really fascinating of how these, and they were largely housewives, in the
Yeah.
middle of Germany, and they had very meager things to use. They might have a potato and 2 ounces of meat, and yet they make this meal out
Yeah.
of it. And that does come from a place of love for sure. And it also comes from a place of ingenuity and
Yes.
scrappiness that I think comes about as you're researching these recipes and sort of leaning into them.
I love what you say about the resourcefulness because I think that's so true. Like I'm always impressed when, you can just whip something together out of the fridge. Like, okay, I've got this ingredient, I've got that ingredient. Now what can I make with it?
Mhm.
And that's, to me, that's so impressive. Like a different level of cooking when you can do that. Where a lot of times I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to the store, I'm going to buy the things I need to make this recipe, right? Like I've already chosen the recipe ahead of time. But to your point of just knowing what you have, what can
Mhm.
you do with it, and the resourcefulness of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course butter. I mean, butter, just always have that on hand. And that was the other
Yep.
thing I learned. Butter makes everything better.
As you were talking, actually, I was thinking about my daughter and I have been reading the Little House on the Prairie series.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it's the one, Big Town, the one with Big Town in the title. And they talk
Mhm.
about making butter. And it's like a 3-page process. And my daughter's 5. And I was like, did you know that that much work went into making butter? Like,
Yeah, it is a lot of work. Yeah.
yeah. And
They
just to
did not
think
take it
about
lightly.
what our ancestors didn't have. They
Hmm.
would have to do all those steps to make the butter just to be able to cook the dish with the butter. I mean,
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I love those stories too. Like how they preserved meat too. I mean,
yes.
I always go back to how did they know how to do this? How did they figure it out? It's
What
fascinating
trial
to
and error
me.
did they go
Yeah,
through
I
with the
know,
meat
right?
to like figure out, yes, salt pork and all of
Yeah.
that? When I was a kid, I actually wanted to be in the Little House on the Prairie books. Like it would have been the hardest life ever, but there was something about it as a child that I was like, no, I want to go try living out on the plains. Or on the
Yeah.
prairie, I guess. Live out on the prairie and do all these things, but it was hard work.
It was, yes, I know. Yeah, hard life, hard days, long days.
Yeah.
Yeah, the amount of chores they have to do, and yeah. So I grew up on a dairy farm, so I could somewhat relate to the long
Okay.
hours and the hard life, and having to be out at 5 a.m. and regardless of the weather and doing chores. But man, they had it much different than the modern life. Just from the very, like you said, just the basic things to have in their house, like butter,
Yeah.
or even having the meat, the process. Because I think one of the books describes the butchering process, and
Yes. It's
how.
that same book because they did the deer.
Oh,
It was the
yeah,
venison. Yeah, it was the venison, I think.
the venison,
Yeah.
yeah, and you. I mean, that's a whole day process, and just things we take for granted. It's pretty
Yeah.
fascinating when you look back at somebody's life story who has lived a very different experience than you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we see that though. I feel like I see the shift of people are going back to like wanting to homestead, right? Like this has become
Hmm.
like a trendy thing and to create with your own hands. And I'm wondering if
Yeah.
maybe that's what I wanted to tap into as a child was like creating these things
Mhm.
and knowing you were behind it. You were the energy that was behind it. And I think we're
Yeah.
seeing a shift of this in our culture somewhat as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that too. In the like the urban gardening is very
Yeah.
big in my neighborhood. There are a lot of
Okay.
chicken coops now,
Yeah.
even in a fairly dense suburban area. Like chickens are allowed,
Yeah.
um, and that's new. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a testament to kind of the pendulum is sort of swinging back to these roots that I think we all kind of hear the call toward,
Yep.
whether it's gardening or preparing or being self-sustaining. I think we have, and I love that we have found this new appreciation for I guess what we would consider art forms. My husband and I were discussing this about quilts
Okay.
just the other day. I don't know if this is true in California, but in the Midwest, quilting stores are becoming more and more popular, um, because it is such an art form, but
Yeah.
it's a practical form of art and craftsmanship. And so we're even seeing the pendulum swing in that regard as well. You know, you could go to Target, you could order a quilt off of Amazon, but there's something very, very special that people are realizing about something that you have created with your own hands using scrap material, which is what my grandma did. You know,
Yeah.
she was a quilter, and that's what she would do. You know, they would never threw away anything. They kept all their old clothes and aprons and things like that, and they would turn them into something else
Yeah.
that they needed for survival. And
Back to
yeah,
the resourcefulness again of
that's
like
right. Yeah.
I'm sure my grandmother is a quilter too, and I am sure that I can picture the quilt that she made me as a kid, and I'm sure my mom still has it in the closet at home. And it's beautiful, and I would never get rid of it, right? Because you know what went into it, and it was made with
Mhm.
love because it's from my grandmother, but from family. And she made one for my oldest son when he was born too. Like, and I remember her calling me like, "What colors are his room gonna be? Like what?" And then she made for him. And now she doesn't do quilting as much anymore. I think obviously it's an intensive
Yeah.
craftsmanship. And so she still makes them blankets and pillowcases, but I think just quilting it's a lot.
It is a lot. Yes, it is. It is meticulous.
Mhm.
I mean, my grandma, she would make quilts for other people. Other people paid her to make
Yeah.
quilts, and she never charged what the quilts were worth because, I mean, it was just hours and hours and hours of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember did your grandma have that big long loom?
She did not. She's always been part of like the sewing clubs. And so I think a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
what she would do is she would do it there. So she has the sewing machine at the house.
Oh,
Um,
gotcha.
but I think
Mhm.
she would go, I remember her taking the quilt somewhere to do I can't remember what that final process is called,
Oh,
but
yeah.
yeah, she would take them and they would do that final
I can't
big
think of it.
process for her.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I can't think of what.
It's not
My
basting, is
grandma,
it?
my grandma would be so disappointed in me.
I know.
But so she actually had the frame. She would go to the church sewing groups as
Yep.
well. But she had the frame in her living room, and she loved watching like, Jeopardy in the afternoon. I just have these memories of her watching Jeopardy, and she was a hand stitcher.
Okay.
So she would
Wow.
hand stitch the quilts and shouting out answers to Jeopardy.
I love it.
It was just such fond memories.
Yes. Do you have any quilts of hers still?
I do,
Okay.
in fact, yeah. And I have she made me one when I got married. So she
Okay.
made us a quilt and made my baby blanket as well. And I actually have a quilt just in my room too. In where I'm speaking right now. So sometimes I will use that, just to
Yeah.
stay warm. It's just a simple little throw size quilt. But
Yeah.
yes, definitely kept some.
I love that so much. And again, like you pull that blanket and you just think of them, right? You get those
Hmm.
memories. The other
Yeah.
question I was going to ask you to tie it back here is, do you have like a common book for yourself? Do you have something that you keep recipes or quotes for your children?
Oh, I don't, but it might be a good idea to start
Yeah.
that.
I just was wondering if it inspired you.
Oh, yeah. No, in some ways, I think that's a great idea. And in fact, I would like my mom to actually do that,
Yeah.
while she's still able to, um, put things down on
Sure.
paper. And, um, But I've never thought about it myself. Now, I do collect recipes. I
Okay.
am intentional about that. And like these recipes that I've found in our family heritage, I have those that I want to pass on to my
Yeah.
girls. And the artifacts like the quilts and the family stories. Um, I have things like that, but I haven't started a common
Okay.
book. Yeah.
Yeah. Not to put you on the spot. I just was, as you were talking, I'm like, that is such a good idea. I should start one.
Mhm. Yes, and I think, I actually saw a YouTube video about it. I guess it's I don't know if you could call it a trend, but it's something that people do even today.
Yeah.
Like if you could YouTube how to start a common book, and you can find some instructions on how to
Oh,
get started and what type of book
okay.
to use.
Well, I know what I'll be doing then. I'll be in the next few days, I'm going to be researching a common book. What have you learned about yourself through writing?
Oh man. I have learned that I am a perfectionist. So I expect a lot of myself in that first draft. I've
Okay.
learned that. So I have learned to s- give myself a lot more grace with that first draft, and to trust the process, as they say.
Yeah.
But just to allow that the first draft, even maybe the second draft, to just be what it is, and let it be rough. It's meant to be rough. Um, and there's always that I'm a much stronger editor than I am a drafter.
Okay.
So just trusting that, those editing skills will kick in when it's time.
Yeah.
So I've
Once you get the
definitely
story there.
that's right. Yeah, I got to
Okay.
get the structure first, and then we can leverage those editing skills.
I love that. Okay. Very interesting. So, and are there other authors that you would say that they're better at like structuring the story? Is it like your brain works differently like that?
Oh yeah, I've
Okay.
definitely, in talking to other authors, there seems to be, you either like one or the other. You either like the
Okay.
writing process, and you don't like the editing, or it's vice versa. You
Okay.
like me. So yeah, it is interesting how different minds work. Different
Yeah.
writers, our processes are so different. And some people like to have a full outline of their story. They like to know, even before they start writing page
Sure.
one, they like to know every detail of how it's gonna, maybe not every detail, but a fairly detailed outline of how the
Sure.
story is gonna go. And I'm not like that. I like to know generally where we're going, and just kind of let the characters take me on an adventure.
I love that. And then I've also heard other authors talk about kind of like the switching gears. It's like you get the book finished and then you have to go to the marketing, but then you're also still trying to maybe work on another book at the same time, and just these different hats you're wearing as an
Yeah.
author as well.
Yeah, it's can be a lot to balance. So that's exactly where I am right now, actually. So I have my first book is out, and still doing marketing for that. You will
Yeah.
always do marketing for every book that you release. But now Divine Proverb of Streusel is out, but I'm also writing book number 3,
Yeah.
and got my eye toward book number 4, because yeah, it's a pretty steady cycle, and you're never solely focused on one book at a time. There's
Yeah.
always layers to it.
Which I have to imagine is nice. So I don't know if the term in the industry is writer's block, but say you're working this third book that you're working on and maybe you're experiencing some writer block. It's like, okay, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to go focus on these other hats that I wear as an author.
Yeah.
And you can just pour your energy into that and you're still feeling like maybe quote unquote you're being productive,
Hmm.
but you're
Yeah.
not stuck over here trying to force something that's just not working at that moment.
Yeah, that's accurate. Yes. So there's always something that you can shift to. And
Yeah.
sometimes when writer's block comes up, you do just need to let it steep for a minute. Just
Yeah.
let it sit and go focus your energy on something else, like you said. And yeah, that's very accurate what you
Okay.
described.
I've noticed some parallels in the podcasting world to authors as well. And it's kind of in that same realm. I mean, we're not writing per se, but there's different hats I can wear. And it's like, well, this is just not, I don't have the energy for this right now. It just feels like I'm stuck. I can go do the other hats that I need to wear as a podcaster and doing the marketing or creating or just
Yeah.
putting the show notes out, just getting that on there. And so I've noticed some parallels along that. And so I'm like, it has to be
Yeah.
similar
Oh,
feeling.
yeah. Yeah. Well, in a way, I guess authors are, in a sense, content creators, just like
Yeah.
podcasters. So, yeah, there are a lot of parallels. You're right.
Yeah. So interesting. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about who you are as a reader and what genres you enjoy.
Yeah, so my number one go-to is either contemporary, followed
Okay.
closely by historical.
You've been so gracious to bring 3 books for us today. Can you tell us a little bit how they pair together?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me tell you first, the books. These are some of my all-time favorite books as a reader, and they have certainly helped shaped my writing in
Okay.
some regard. So the first is Little Women,
Okay.
classic Louisa May Alcott. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is one of my all-time favorites. And then Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe.
Okay.
And one of the things that ties all of those together is, well, first of all, they do deal with small town, more, rural life settings, but they also have that intergenerational relationship and dynamic to them.
Yeah.
And so like with Little Women, it's Jo March and her mom. Her mom is so full of wisdom. Any Little Women fans out there know what I mean. Like Marmee is so full of life wisdom that is relevant regardless of what generation you're in. And then with To Kill a Mockingbird, it's Scout Finch and her father Atticus. They had just such a special relationship that I very much admire. And then with Fried Green Tomatoes, it's Evelyn and the woman that she meets in the nursing home, Mrs. Threadgood. And Mrs. Threadgood, of course, is taking this opportunity to share her life story with Evelyn, who is sort of struggling her way through life. And Mrs. Threadgood's stories helps inspire some things in Evelyn's life. And I just love that, the way that the generations are coming together and there's wisdom being shared from one to the next. And they both impact each other too. It's not just the older generation impacting the younger. There's always an upward influence as well. So those are some of my favorite books of all time. And they're all classics and they're classics for a reason. They resonate with so many people.
Yeah, I actually felt so much of just what you were talking about, of that influencing in both directions. I felt that so much when I was reading your book, The Extraordinary Deaths of
Mm.
Mrs. Kipp, and how they were influencing one another. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so true. The quote that I have at the end of the show is that books are like people and they come into your life when we most need them. And I
Oh,
think that fits perfectly here, of it's just that wisdom that is imparted between both of us, and we all can provide value to one another's lives if we just take the time to listen.
oh, amen. So beautifully said. And I love that quote that you use at the end. It's so true, so
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, stories are like those friends that we need at just the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. And they'll come walk alongside us. And I had a gentleman way back on episode 27, and he said that, basically along the lines of like, we're all coming to a book with our struggles of the day, our joy of the day, our happiness of the day. And he had this list of things, and it was so beautiful. And it just was, and that book is going to impact you based off of, where
Mm,
you're showing up today to that book.
yeah. Oh, love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that because the book number 3 that I'm working on right now, it's I guess it kind of promotes that a little bit in the sense that so it's about a mom and her 2 grown daughters who are going on a bookish road trip around the
Oh,
heartland
okay.
and all these different sites around. So they're based in Kansas City and they kind of go clockwise around Kansas City into
Okay.
Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, Oklahoma. and every stop, they're immersing themselves in that the author or the book that is connected to that particular town, but they're all interpreting the book in a different way. It's hitting them in a different way based on what are their struggles at that moment. What lens are they coming to that story with? And that's a beautiful thing about stories is not only are we get out of it what we're meant to get out of it in that time.
Yeah.
So, for instance, with To Kill a Mockingbird, I've read that book. That's probably the book I've read the most on repeat. Okay. And I first read it in high school. Well, how I read it in high school and what I took away from it in high school is very different than how it's hitting me now as a mom of teenage daughters. And that's just such a beautiful thing about stories is it's the lens through which you're seeing it that day, and it could be a different lens 5 years from now, but yet you're still getting new layer of meaning out of it.
Yeah.
Every time you come to it.
I was thinking the same thing because I reread To Kill a Mockingbird last year, and again, so different, much different take on it than when I read it for high school reading. And that's why they're classics, though, right? They've held the test of time, and I think about this to very similar as the Bible, right? You could read that how many times,
right?
But you come to it in the lens or a struggle of that moment, and that message is just going to be that much more impactful at that time.
Yeah. And something different will jump out at you. It's like, how did I never see that before? But it's because I believe it's because you were meant to see it in that moment at that time. It's like a little gift for exactly that struggle that you're in at the moment.
Yeah. And the depth of those books, right? Or these books that have held the test of time. I think that's why they have, is because there is so much depth to the story that it will hit you differently at different periods of your life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I wonder if these authors, as an author, do you think about that? Like,
sort of. Okay. I mean, I think about it in the sense that the story that I put out into the world, I want it to have fruit in the reader's life, and I definitely pray for that, and I pray that it will impact readers, come alongside what's already happening in the reader's life in that moment. And if that happens 50 years from now, people are still reading Mrs. Kipp, then I mean, praise God for that, because that means that it's still producing fruit. And that's the whole goal for me as an author, is I just want the stories to produce fruit for however long that season is. So I think about it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for asking that or answering that. I feel like that's really, I've never thought about asking a guest that, but as our conversation has progressed, I'm like, that's something interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
I mean, and I don't know that, Louisa May Alcott or Harper Lee would have, I know Harper Lee, based on biographies that I've read of her, I don't think authors can anticipate how a book is going to land with readers or that it's going to take off the way that it does. But what a special blessing when it does. And to know that something that you help bring into the world is having an impact on people.
Yeah. And a special blessing for us as a reader as well, that we get to read your stories. So thank you. So one last question here about reading. How do you find time in your day to read?
Oh, some days it's easier than others, but I think it's so important as an author to always be reading.
Sure.
And to be reading widely, a lot of different genres and styles and cultures. So I tend to carve out time at night, sort of reserve that time. Keeps me from scrolling through my phone too late at night. So
agreed.
So I usually have a book on my bedside every night, and I work my way through that. Okay. Yeah. So that's how I work it in.
Yeah. Where do you get your book recommendations from?
Largely from Instagram, honestly, and other book lovers. The authors, of course. I'm immersed in the author network authors are always readers first. And
Sure.
so, and they're usually very widely read. So I get a lot of recommendations from fellow authors as well.
Okay. I love that. Because I feel like that's the thing, right? Part of the impetus behind why I created this show is I wanted to read more widely, right? It's like I have my go-to genres, but there's so many other books out there. And for example, I had said I was not a fantasy reader, although I did like Harry Potter, but it just was never a genre I would gravitate towards. But these genres can be so big. I'm like, well, where would I even start if I wanted to see if I might like fantasy? It's just like, what if I start talking to people about different genres? I mean, that was where I started way back when I started the show. Was I had friends that were a fantasy reader that read romantic fiction. I'm like, can you come on and give us 3 books that would pair if we really wanted to sample this genre and see if we liked it?
Oh,
And it has
nice.
morphed into so much more than that, I think. But that was way back when I started the show. That was where I started, was just to read more widely and try different genres.
Nice.
So,
Yeah.
and I thought others might want to do that too. You know, like you're saying, as authors, we try to read widely. So it's like, well, I think we're all trying. I mean, and we have so little
Hmm.
time to read and to devote to
Yeah.
reading. So it was like, well, let's go to someone that's a trusted source, or that this is their
Yeah.
go-to genre. They can really speak to that genre for us.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think the trusted source, I mean, you tend to very quickly sort of nail down who are those people
Yeah.
that have similar taste to you, but will also challenge you to read beyond your comfort zone.
Yep.
Um, so I definitely have some people like that who will challenge me to read beyond what I personally would pick up or
Yeah.
gravitate to, but I very much trust their opinion about whether or not this is worth the limited time that you
Yeah.
have to actually read.
Yeah. And I love that that's a way to continue to foster a friendship too, right? As if you're thinking about, or they message you like, hey, I think you'd really like this book. It's just this little
Mhm.
ping in your ear of like, you were thinking about me, that I would like this book,
Aw.
and like, and then, and vice versa, right? Back and forth relationship again is I'll read something and I'm like, oh, I got to go tell my friend Ashley, right? Like I know, because I know she really would like that style of book. And so I think in a way, it just kind of fosters your friendships too. If you're, I moving around a lot. My friends are local to me a lot of times. They're living
Mm.
many miles away. So for me, it's just this way. Again, maybe another way to love your friends, right? I thought about you when I read this book, so I wanted to just share it.
Oh, yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, it
So
does foster a deep and meaningful relationship when you
yeah.
can share stories like that.
Yeah, and back to this third book you're working on. I think that sounds like a bookish vacation I want to go on, but I imagine the books and the story will do this for your characters as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's stories have a way of sort of bringing out what we're feeling
Yeah.
in way it maybe give us words to
Mhm.
express what we're feeling. I have found that to be true as a reader. Sometimes I just don't know, is what I'm feeling normal? I mean, does anybody else struggle with this?
Yes.
And there's a famous quote. I don't know who said it, but it's we read to know that we're not alone.
Yes.
And so that's one thing that I deeply, deeply appreciate about stories, especially authors who write story who are very vulnerable and put themselves on the page. Sometimes they are giving me the words to express what I'm going through or what I'm feeling,
Yeah.
and that helps in relationships in a number of ways.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think just that comfort to, again, know that you are not the only person out there in the world that is experiencing whatever you're experiencing. I think
right.
sometimes I see that gives me like, I can tone it down a little bit of like, okay, I'm not the first person that has been here. I will get through. Someone else made it through and I will too.
That's right. Yeah. Gives you a beacon of hope.
Yes, absolutely. Beacon of hope. I think that's perfect. Well, let's finish off the show here with what I call our bonus pairings, and they're just a speed round of questions. So these can be pretty quick.
Ooh.
So, where is your favorite place to read?
Oh, in bed, cuddled up in bed.
Love it. And then, what is one book you have read that has changed your life?
That's a hard question. Okay, so I will have to go with The Grapes of Wrath by John
Okay.
Steinbeck.
Yep.
Should I explain or
Yeah.
just?
Yeah. Tell
Okay.
us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So John Steinbeck, I actually discovered him when I was an early teenager. And, so I kind of graduated from like the Ramona series and Little
Okay.
House on the Prairie to John Steinbeck.
That's a big
And
jump.
that is a big jump. And I didn't understand it, right? Like it hit
Sure.
me very differently back then. But the one thing that Steinbeck showed me is that he always set his stories in small towns,
Okay.
most of his stories. And he showed me how to deal with real life contemporary issues in a very artful and meaningful way. So that
I love that.
revolutionized my view of the purpose of story.
I love that. I just read East of Eden, right? That's
Oh,
Steinbeck.
yeah. Hmm.
I read that
Hmm.
this year. I decided to tackle it. I try to do, I try to insert the classics every now and then. And that was one I don't think I read in high school. So I was like, I'm going to tackle that
Yeah,
one this year.
that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you a rereader?
Oh, yes, for
Okay.
sure. If it's a book that I absolutely love, for sure. And I'm a rereader, I'm a highlighter, I'm a
Okay.
dog-earer, like
Yeah.
all the things. Yeah.
You really get in the book there.
Yes, exactly.
I had to give myself permission to like write in books because I think it was so ingrained in my mind of like, no, I don't do that. And I guess I get a lot of books from the library as well. But I was like,
Oh, true.
when I started highlighting and I was like, it felt so foreign to me doing it. I'm like, I don't think I should be
Oh.
doing this.
Well, can I just say, and I know a lot of people have that treasured view of books and
Yeah.
rightfully so, but I will say as an author, that is a huge compliment. If somebody
Okay.
is highlighting and interacting and dog-earing a book, like there is no
Yeah.
greater compliment than that, in my opinion.
Yeah. I love that. The interacting with a book. That's a great way of saying that.
Mhm.
So, well, thank you for sharing that. And then
Yeah.
last question here. What are you reading next?
Actually, what I'm reading right now is Dickens and his Christmas Carol.
Oh, I
It's
love
it's
that.
been on it's been on my list for a while, but I'm finally getting into it, and it's very enjoyable. I'm only 4 or 5 chapters in, but really
Yeah.
enjoying this story.
And there's so many references to the Christmas Carol right throughout our pop culture and all
Yeah,
of that. So I imagine it's going to be really fun to go back to the true source of that.
yeah. Yeah, and it's also, it's a fictionalized version of how he wrote the book and or he yeah, wrote the story. And so you're kind of getting that author point of view as well.
Oh, okay. I was thinking this was the Christmas Carol, but I guess I misunderstood
Oh,
that. Okay.
no, it's a novelized version and it's called
Oh,
Dickens and His Christmas Carol. It's a fictionalized version of how and why the Christmas Carol came about in Dickens' life and what
I
was going
love
on in
that.
his life at the time and the struggles that he was going through. And so I'm learning a lot about it's historical fiction. So I'm learning a
Okay.
lot about him, but also just what his author process was like. And again,
That's
we
cool.
read to know that we're not alone. And so he also struggled with a lot of the same writing things that modern authors struggle with.
Yes. Okay. Well, that sounds like a really cool book now that I know the whole premise of it. Not that the Christmas Carol isn't fantastic as well, but
Right. Right, right. Yeah.
yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show with me today. I know your time is precious and I appreciate all you've given me.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a fun conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode today with Sara Brunsvold and her book flight of intergenerational stories. We'd love to hear what other books you'd pair with this book flight at bookishflights.com. That is also where you can find more information on today's flight and any other books that we talked about today. I want to inspire a community of readers. So whenever you share a post about what you are reading or what you are picking up next, especially if you have heard about the book on the show, please tag us. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Bookish Flights. This is a brand new show, so if you enjoyed it, please head over to Apple Podcasts and give the show a review. Your review not only helps me, but it also helps the show reach others. Make sure you are subscribed on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to make sure that you will not miss an episode. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.